Facilities that make this program possible are provided by the City of Highland Park. Programs are produced independently by members of the community. The City of Highland Park is not affiliated with the following program or the producers of public access programming and is not responsible for the content. The following program does not reflect the opinions of the City of Highland Park.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Dotson. I'm the founder and program coordinator for Highland Park Poetry and your host today for Poetry Today. My guest is Arlen Miller. Arlen Miller is a published writer with poetry as her primary genre. Through Poetic License Inc., which Arlen founded and directs, she has taught thousands of people poetry-based expressive writing in schools, community venues, and professional development workshops. Arlen works with learners of all ages and abilities, including seasoned writers and people with cognitive challenges. She is the senior editor of Poetic License Press, publishing creative writing that is authentic, accessible, and engaging. Arlen holds a BA from the University of Michigan, a JD from the University of Illinois, and a certificate in creative writing poetry from Northwestern University, in addition to having attended numerous writing and teaching workshops across the country and internationally. And you can find more about Arlen's work at www.poeticlicenseinc.net. Well, Arlen, I am so glad to finally get you on this show.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for your persistence.
So I know that you're a wonderful teacher. I personally have attended several of your workshops. I know we did the on plein air workshop at Sunset Woods Park several years ago, and we also did one at the Art Center. And you're just really very inspiring. And so I guess I wanted to start with your talking about some of the different workshop experiences. I mean, you talk about having students of all ages and all abilities. And so I'd love to hear more.
Right. Thank you. Well, I fell in love with poetry at an early age, A Child's Garden of Verses, and had left it for a while and came back to it. But, I really believe in the power and playfulness of poetry. And I'm just its ambassador. I'm out there spreading the word. So I oftentimes work in schools. I'm an independent contractor and they bring me in, and sometimes it might be a complete poetry unit or it could be a supplement. Maybe we've done things like writing poetry that kids bring with them on their trips to Washington, D.C. when they visit Arlington National Cemetery. So they have poems written as letters of address. Rather than just running amok. I am going to be doing this spring a workshop that I've done a couple of times before that I particularly enjoy, which is at Ravinia Elementary, where I pair up with their art teacher.
Oh, neat.
And this year, Heller Nature Center is going to be our partner as well, and the kids spend some time outside and they do watercolors and poetry and learn some science, and really part of what I love so much about poetry and what it shares with so many other disciplines is its focus on observation, close observation and reflection. So whether I'm working with kids or mainstream adults or adults with disabilities, often that's part of the focus. So I've been doing a lot of work lately with the Epilepsy Foundation of Greater Chicago in tandem with an art therapist, and that's one of the great things too about poetry, because it's like, lots of opportunities for play, as we have done in pairing up too. So, especially for folks who might have some cognitive challenges or difficulty with expressive language, poetry can be a very sort of welcoming, forgiving kind of form of expression, and especially when paired with visual art. And for people who are don't always feel understood or heard, to have that medium to express themselves and feel recognized and seen and heard. One of my favorite quotes about poetry. I think it's Charles Simic who says a poem is someone else's snapshot in which you see yourself. And so that's sort of the driving force is, poetry as a way of feeling a little less alone, feeling connected, building empathic bridges, things of that sort.
And so I guess
very
the funny
fun.
thing is that many adults, and I don't mean, adults of
Uh-huh.
all abilities, who went through school and they became intimidated by
Right,
poetry. They
right,
lost that
right.
early childhood appreciation
right.
for words that rhyme or
Right,
that playfulness,
right.
and they are intimidated by it. So
Right.
how do you reach out to people and
you know,
tear down some of that fear?
I just say, I think my own enthusiasm for it is somewhat infectious. Well, if
that's
people
true.
see it or hear
That's
it,
true.
that usually, if they are curious enough to come find out a little about it, sometimes, we're doing readings. I think people find it much more accessible than they think. And so I say and really believe if you think you don't like poetry, you haven't met the right poem yet. And I'm sure you can vouch for this. If you think you can't write it, you're wrong. So, I will go head to head against any long form writer, memoir or novel. A lot of times adults say, I wish I had the time. But poetry's a short form. So all you need is like 5 minutes after the shower, 10 minutes in the doctor's office. And when people say, I sit in front of a big sheet of blank white paper and I'm not sure what to do, I say, don't use a big sheet of blank white paper. Like take a gum wrapper or a napkin and just start with some words or some images. You don't even need paper, you just need a pen because you can write on your shoe or your hand. You can always find something to write on. So I don't know, I feel like I've been able to convince people fairly easily, and people will say, oh, I didn't know that was poetry. So sometimes I try to just use words like poetry-ish, poetic. And sometimes in workshops people might use those techniques for an essay or a short story or another genre, but I think they're still applicable and applicable to good writing across the board.
So you mentioned in your bio that you do write other forms. It's just that you
Right
now we're really
primarily
focused on talking about poetry, but obviously it influences your other writing as well.
Right, it does. So I sometimes have written essays and articles for local papers or magazines, and usually it's sort of covering the arts beat or things of human interest. But primarily when I'm generating my own creative work, it's writing, and then now, acting and the capacity as an editor for Poetic License Press. So, which is very helpful because, most of us who have written and submitted poems have see that it's an arduous task, and when you are on the other side of it, you see how difficult it is, and the editors are genuine, and it really is true that there's so much good stuff that there just isn't room for in each single publication. But the good news is there's so many different publications and forums, like the Muses Gallery, and so many spots for it. So.
Well, thanks for the mention of Highland Park Poetry. That's great.
Right.
Well, and what a perfect segue for us to then now shift gears and sort of talk about Poetic License Inc. and Press. Poetic License Press is the imprint where you're actually acting as the editor.
Right.
What was the genesis of that?
So I think, a few different things. I mean, there's so many kinds of poetry, and I like many kinds, but the idea for this press was authentic, accessible, and engaging, like poetry for every person, every day. And I had gone to literary conferences where I sometimes saw like things, little matchbooks and objects, and I liked that idea, and I thought, I wonder what it would take to try something like that. Mm-hmm. And so A Midnight Snack was the first project, Poems to Start Your Day. And it was just...
No, a light breakfast.
I'm sorry, a light breakfast, right, a midnight snack. A midnight snack came next. So a light breakfast was Poems to Start Your Day, and just packaged in a coffee bag, meant to be not intimidating. And, put out a call, what's called a call for words, to invite people to submit poetry, mostly through people I had known. And then they were just printed. Ken's Print Shop, which is, I think, at Deerfield or Highland Park.
Highland Park, yeah.
Business printed them out for me. The not really a specific theme other than kind of lighthearted a little bit if they're to start your day, and because of the size of these cards, they could only be so long. And the idea was, in part of my ambassadorial role, was people could just pull one of these and tuck it in a lunchbox or a briefcase and share the wealth that way. And also, I really wanted it to be a level playing field, so poets are not identified by accolades or lack of accolades, just their name, where they live, and what they like to have for breakfast.
I love that.
And when we put it together, I invited poets to my house and served a light breakfast. And we went around the table to collate them, and bookstores who hosted us, put out muffins and orange juice, and so that was lovely.
Wow.
And the next project, maybe about a year later, was a midnight snack, poems for late night reading. So this is a little bit maybe of a darker tone, and although, not completely, a little, maybe some are a little more surreal. And this time I allowed more space for poems to be able to flow over to the backside. But again, poets identified just by where they live and what keeps them up late at night. So.
That's good.
And though people were clamoring for a hot lunch, I took a break from the food themed ones. And what's coming up next is in plein air. And so I had been spending more time outside and had taken a class actually in Highland Park at Bethel that had to do with landscape a couple of summers ago. And that was just enough impetus to get me going in that direction. So broader call for words through some literary conferences and different universities and anyone we could. And really, we have a broad cross-section of poets from across the country, some from across the globe. Oh, and all of the poems have to do with a response to being in the natural world. But when I say natural world or outside, it might be an urban environment, rural, so a whole range. And this time as well, it will include art. So initially, there was a call for art. And once we decided it was going to be more than just a few poems for a chapbook, but really more a full-length book.
Wow.
We've got 52 poems by 43 poets. We decided to have a single illustrator to add some continuity. So
these are ink draw? Pen and
graphite,
ink, or?
actually,
Okay.
which
Oh, neat.
was challenging to reproduce.
Okay.
But I found a wonderful illustrator. I go to a wonderful writer's retreat in Ashfield, Massachusetts, called Wellspring House, and found it's sort of this Brigadoon, wonderful artistic agrarian community, and found a landscape architect probably in his 70s, and he also does watercolors, and cajoled him to do these illustrations. So I went up there, and for 4 days we sat side by side, and it was wonderful to get to read the poems aloud, and him sort of veering off, looking in the middle distance, and us talking about which lines resonated for us. So
So
it was
how many
wonderful.
illustrations did he do for the collection?
Maybe we have about a dozen. I mean, he
Okay.
did more than we were able to use
Sure.
because, and it's always a learning curve, what reproduced well, what didn't.
okay.
So I've learned for the next go around. In fact, I'm taking up in Lake Forest a class right now called Watercolor for people who are sure they can't paint, in the hopes that I might be able to actually do the illustrations next time.
Okay.
But it's really, and this time for the first time since it was a bound book, I worked with a book designer,
Oh, wow.
also a woman in her 70s outside of Ashfield. So it was really just, it's been
Another
really
connection
lovely.
through this Wellspring?
Yes, through
Okay.
Wellspring House, and Walt the illustrator knew her, and so it all felt really good. I mean, there's the sort of business aspects of paper, and pricing it, and
Sure.
layout and those kinds of things. But it really is a great pleasure, and I can't wait for it to come out, which we're hoping will be soon.
Right,
Right,
yes.
yeah.
Well, I'll give a sneak Yeah, definitely. Highland Park Poetry is really hoping to host one of many perhaps publication parties, events, reading event for in plein air. So folks should just be sure to check the highlandparkpoetry.org website and our schedule of events. Likely the event will be in 2018, so
Right.
early 2018.
Right,
So.
right.
And what was the next thing? Yeah, I mean, so what about the poets? I mean, did you accept all the poems that were submitted, or
no, we
how many
didn't.
did you receive
Oh,
from the call
gosh.
for words?
You know, we probably received submissions from well over 100 poets, I'm
Oh, wow.
sure.
Okay.
But, you know, I started to realize, and I think I'll be more focused on this in the future up front, that I wanted just greater diversity and to give more voice.
Okay.
So I reached out to some contacts for writers of color, writers with disabilities, writers from some more urban areas. So, you know, it was just kind of finding balance. And in fact, I had been maintaining sort of a blog through the website as the process unfolded, and some of this is on there still, that, you know, with something small like this, you know, that isn't bound, an individual poem that is beautiful and has lots of images can stand on its own. But once it's bound, who its buddies are, who its neighbors
right.
are,
I didn't even
and, you
think
know,
about that.
once you have
Yeah, sure.
53 of them, then you're sort of looking, it's almost like a play or a longer piece of music where it's sort of
How
like
do you
what
organize
complements
them?
what,
Yeah.
right? And if we have a lot of narrative, now are we looking for some imagistic? And, you know, even in terms of
neat.
what
Okay.
goes next to which and how you do chapter heads.
So in this, you mentioned your blog. Is that still available on your
Yes,
website?
it is. It's under the resources section.
Okay, so that's www.poeticlicense.net.
License.inc.net.
Okay, great. Well, I hope people
And I
will check
guess,
that out.
you know, if I can, one thing I want to say, because so many of us who write are on that end, of course, of getting rejections. And one thing that was really interesting for me with this, that, you know, the people who get rejected don't necessarily know, though I've tried to say it in the letters, is I feel like they're still very much a part of this collection. Like, it helped shape our thinking about the direction for it. I feel like I sort of still kind of carry many of them, you know,
okay.
with me, and it might help inform future collections. So those really are sort of part of the team still, even like
Yeah.
if they're on the bench or, you
Right.
know, almost like crew in a theater production. So,
Yeah.
and I know that made me feel a little bit better about the times where I'm submitting my own work, which sometimes gets accepted and sometimes doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to be
Did
on
you,
that end of
being
it.
sitting on the editor side, did you have any, or do you have any sort of tips or hints for poets who are just starting to submit?
I mean, I still think it makes sense to write about what interests you most or what moves you most. And I think most editors probably have their own aesthetic. I usually am drawn to something that has some sort of emotional appeal to it. So I heard Ellen Bass, whose work will be included in Plein Air, say, and I feel this way when I'm reading poems, that she wants her poems to transform. And I do kind of like to feel that when I exit a poem, I'm a little bit different than before I entered it. Not necessarily in a huge way, but maybe thinking about something familiar but in a new way, or some sort of unusual use of language. And I feel ambivalent even saying that, because I particularly remember when I had started writing, editors always saying, you know, we want something fresh, we want something, and thinking like, you know, what does that mean, right? When you're writing it for the first time, it feels fresh.
Yeah.
But I guess the other thing I would say is just reading lots of poetry and
Yeah.
seeing, you know, what do you like about other people's work? What was interesting, you know, to you? So in different venues have different things that they are, you know, that they're looking for.
Are
So-
there any poets that you're drawn to when you're reading and stretching your mind?
Oh,
What are
so
your-
much, and then one will lead to another to another. So I was lucky enough to take an intensive writing workshop from Ellen Bass and really liked her work. I think that it is accessible and interesting and a fresh take. So, you know, I love people like Mark Doty, and, you know, Sharon Olds is a popular one with everyone, or with many people who read contemporary poetry. So I like poetry in translation sometimes. There was somebody
really? Okay.
Icelandic who was great, and
Neat.
I just, you know, my
I mean,
own
you don't
taste is
speak
broad.
Icelandic.
No, it's in translation. So, you know, sometimes I like something thematic. I like language itself. So sometimes there's poetry that's like takes on dictionary terminology, things of that sort. So, and I like to read not just poetry, but memoirs or things that include poetry. Like there's a great book out called A Poet in the House, and poets talking about spirituality and to what extent that informed their work or didn't. And so I like to take a look at that stuff too.
Oh, neat. I like
Yeah.
that idea
Yeah.
of, well, I mean, so did, was the book also include the poems as some,
Yes,
as well
yes,
as like
it
sort
did.
of
It
essay
include-
writing
Yes,
as well? So
yes,
was a
it would
little bit of
include
both?
several poems, and so you could see
Okay.
that. So, and then also, just I think I have been increasingly in the last several years collaborating more with artists and other medium, and I think that can be a really fun way of exploring
Well, you do a
poetry
lot
and
of
other forms
collaboration
reading.
with your teaching. I mean,
Right.
it seems that a lot of those situations you are collaborating
Right,
with
right,
the
right,
teacher
right,
in
right.
the classroom or in a
Right,
a
and you know, our
special setting.
therapist at the Epilepsy Foundation
Yeah.
happens to be the art teacher at Ravinia and sometimes at other schools. And then, you know, through that class this summer, just interesting. You know, usually when I'm taking writing workshops, it's mostly writers, but it's interesting to take cross-disciplinary workshops where I'm in with a lot of visual artists and seeing, you know, seeing things through their eyes, which is sometimes a little different. And, you know, even the process of writing in a more embodied way, moving around, writing on large pieces of paper, incorporating color,
Okay.
you know, things of that sort. So I'd love to experiment more with movement, you know, with
Oh, wow,
music.
okay.
So
All right.
I would
Yeah.
need the movement person and the music person. So.
But you can contribute the word section. right?
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Well, speaking of your words, do you have some poems with you that you might be able to
I
read?
do. I have a couple of poems. I have a couple of poems. Typically, when I have an anthology, I include maybe one of my own. So I will read from A Light Breakfast, if I have it. You know, and when people talk about, well, what should I write about? And I often talk about this with young students who sometimes feel like, oh, enough hasn't happened to me yet. That it doesn't have to be, you know, a grand topic. So we had been dog sitting, which I really prefer, I think, to owning a dog. That taught me that. And we had this wonderful big golden doodle staying with us. So this was for him. It's called Dog Nap for Scout. Oh, to surrender to the afternoon light. Lie your honey-colored self down on the oak floorboards, the sun blessing you in a quilt of shadowed window panes. The kitchen hums in shades of amber. April shines her countenance upon you. So just a short little moment, right? I've also heard it said that a novel is like a film and a poem is like a snapshot.
Okay.
And I sometimes think that's why I don't know that I could write a novel, because my sense for plot, I think that would be very hard
Okay.
for me. But that sort of, how do you capture a moment? And then from A Midnight Snack, and this had been published in After Hours, which
Okay.
is a Chicago literary journal and a great place for local poets and new writers to submit their work. And it's called Even After. I should have thrown them out days ago, the bunch of tulips you brought me, but their deepening to garnet kept me from it, the way some of the petals slipped open and askew, like shoulder straps of a gown after the music has stopped. Petals leaning against the kitchen air, the way warm skin leaves its sheer imprint against a garment, even after it's been slipped off. And while I'm thinking about it, for folks who are interested in seeing poetry and art integrated, there's an exhibit up now at Bethel in Highland Park on Sheridan Road on the theme of family. And so it's a lot of visual art, but Lois Barr, who I think has been on your show before,
she's even hosted.
Yeah, has some great stuff. She worked with an artist in tandem where she wrote some poems in response to the woman's artwork that had to do with family heirlooms, and then the artist constructed some artwork in response to her poem, and so it's just very interesting. One poet who is also local has like a photograph of her mother's wedding dress that has some water damage, and she incorporated some text in there. So
and you've got work
I
as
do.
well?
I do. I buddied up, thankfully, with Marla Snyder, who I'm taking this watercolor class from, and she helped me. I wrote a poem in response to the summer experience called "On the Theme of Family," and we had it printed out large on 30 by 30 on like a transparency, and then she helped me with a watercolor. I mean, I'm laughing a little bit because I'm comfortable with words, but you know, when it came to the paint, she was like, just put the brush, you know, on the paper. Just do it, just do it. And she helped me. I also had a poem about each one of my 3 children that I had written some years back, but she helped me come up with some images and put those on canvas, and then the poetry is laid over it. So that's a very interesting sort of experience, very different than ekphrastic poetry where people are writing in response to art, where you're trying to incorporate writing and art, and then you're trying to decide, well, what's in the foreground, what's in the background. And I think, you know, a couple of years ago I did a cinepoem, which was a series of 3 poems with video images. And that too, you know, just making those decisions about, do you want to just read aloud? Do you want the text to appear on the page? You know, do you want there to be music? Not. But I think those ways are really exciting ways, especially to bring kids into the fold, and in schools that are very interested in you know, incorporating technology. We've got out here from a project I did not too long ago at Avoca School, which I had taken the torch passed from you on the Poetry in Motion project from Highland Park Poetry, where we worked with the digital arts teacher at Avoca and a poet colleague of mine, Susan Gunlock, and it was just great for a whole year. It was one day after school every week, and kids came in and they took photographs and worked on their artwork and worked on poetry, and then we paired them up and they were placed in PACE buses for 6 months. Very so cool. That the kids got to have that kind of visibility for themselves, and the bus riders were treated to some poetry, and they're on display as well at the Chicago Literacy Alliance.
Oh, wow. That's
so
wonderful.
Those kinds of things are really great. The spring, I'm not sure if I had mentioned that the spring, the work that the students come up with will be on display at Heller Nature Center in July and in August.
Well, you know, it's always so exciting to hear about poetry in the community.
Right.
Because oftentimes people don't find ways. I mean, you know, your example of a light breakfast where you could put it in someone's lunchbox or a briefcase. It's hard to actually get poetry in the community. So it's nice when they're unexpected.
And I think also people think of writing as like the solitary experience always, you know, that you're up and, you know, and you know, when I first started writing, that was true. I had to have a certain bandana on and be in a certain chair. But, you know, I had a friend who suggested to me being writing partners, which I thought seemed really crazy. But once we did that and started meeting at the Barnes & Noble in Deerfield, it really broke for me the fear of like writing in public. So I'll just sit down on a museum floor, you know, I'll write anywhere. And I do have a writing partner who I work with on Thursday afternoons, and it keeps us both accountable. She's working on a book about a modality of marital counseling. You know, she's a therapist by day.
You don't have to have the same
synergy. No, you know, we just both show up and have a lunch break together. But she gives me input on my work, and I give her input on her work. You know, mine, it probably has to do a little more with the writing, and hers, she helps me with maybe, you know, stumbling blocks psychologically to submitting, and some of the interpersonal kinds of aspects.
Well, I'm going to have to stop you there. We are out of
Thank
time,
you.
but thank you so much
Thank
for being
you
my
so
guest.
much.
It's been
You made it
wonderful
really
to...
easy.
Oh, good. Good.
What my reticence was. Thank you.
Well,
It's
thanks,
been
and we're
great.
excited for In Plein Air. We look forward
Thank
to seeing
you.
you.